Nick didn't believe in miracles, but that morning, something felt different. The room was just as he left it: pale walls, cold light, the persistent beep of the heart monitor. Nothing had changed, except for one thing. On the nightstand, between an untouched glass of water and a forgotten pair of glasses, lay an open Bible. No one had seen it brought in. No nurse admitted leaving it. Yet there it was, and it was open to a page that didn't seem random, as if the book had been nudged by invisible hands that still believed, even when Nick no longer could. He stared at it for a few moments, first with confusion, then with something almost physical, a discomfort in his chest. It had been years since he last touched a Bible. The last time he saw one, his father was dying, reciting verses that, to Nick, had sounded hollow. But now, he was the one lying in a hospital bed. He was the one wondering if there was still time. He was the one aching not with fear, but with absence. Because when silence stretches too long, even those who don't believe start listening. Reached out, he didn't know why. He didn't know to whom, but he felt he had to. His eyes fell upon the text, a psalm speaking of pain, of weariness, of trembling bones, but also ... of mercy. And there, alone, surrounded by the smell of disinfectant and waiting, Nick whispered in a voice barely audible, "Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger. If you know someone who needs healing, an answer, a sign, write their name in the comments now. If this story has already touched you, leave a like. And if you believe God still walks into rooms no one else enters, subscribe." Sometimes an open page can change everything. The text was there, marked as if read many times, yet the pages were untouched. No fingerprints, no creases, just ... open, and Nick's eyes, without knowing why, began to follow each line as if they were the last words he'd ever read. It wasn't a beautiful psalm, not comforting at first glance. It was a lament, a cry, from someone at rock bottom begging for mercy. "Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger, or discipline me in your wrath. Have mercy on me, Lord, for I am weak. Heal me, Lord, for my bones are in agony. My soul is in deep anguish. How long, Lord? How long?" Psalm 6:2, 1-3. Nick didn't know how to pray, but these words, they sounded so much like what he was feeling. It was as if the Bible had answered questions he hadn't even asked. An ancient prayer, still alive, even for someone who thought he no longer deserved to be heard. And in that moment, when there were no visitors, no hope, no explanations, there was faith, fragile but alive. "Turn, Lord, and deliver me. Save me because of your unfailing love. Among the dead, no one proclaims your name, who praises you from the grave." Psalm 4-5. The words were heavy, direct, and still. Something in them didn't scare him. They were honest, desperate, and maybe that's why ... so human. Nick kept reading aloud, not for himself, not even for God, but as if trying to reach someone far away, someone deep inside him. "I am worn out from my groaning. All night long I flood my bed with weeping and drench my couch with tears. My eyes grow weak with sorrow. They fail because of all my foes." Psalm 6:2, 6-7. Nick closed his eyes for a moment. For the first time in weeks, he felt his chest loosen. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was relief, a silent presence, as if someone were sitting beside him, holding his hand without saying a word, as if that prayer was being heard not by a distant God, but by a father who knew every tear, even the ones Nick never dared to cry. "Away from me, all you who do evil, for the Lord has heard my weeping. The Lord has heard my cry for mercy. The Lord accepts my prayer. All my enemies will be overwhelmed with shame and anguish. They will turn back and suddenly be put to shame." Psalms 6-8-10. Nick didn't understand everything, but he understood what mattered. This wasn't just reading. It was a calling for someone who had already given up, a calling for him, and maybe a calling for you too. If you're watching this right now, pause, take a breath, and say this out loud. Even if it's in a whisper, even if people are around, say it with me, as if your soul were crying for help. "Lord, have mercy on me. Heal what no one can see. Calm the trembling in my bones. Enter my story, even if I think it's too late. Hear my prayer, because today, I need to believe you. Still listen." If you managed to say that prayer, even with a trembling voice, then it wasn't you who started it. It was God who placed the words on your lips. And if you know someone who needs to feel this right now, someone who's sick, someone who's tired, someone who no longer believes, share this video. Because a single prayer can travel through walls, down hospital hallways, and reach exactly where it hurts most. Write in the comments the name of someone you love who needs healing. Write it as an act of faith. And if you believe this prayer could change someone's future, subscribe to this channel and leave a like, because the next person who needs this might find it through you. Nick had never seen himself as a spiritual man. In his younger years, religion felt like empty ceremonies, broken promises, and prayers repeated like echoes with no reply. His life had been shaped by distance from his daughter, from his own feelings, from anything resembling faith. Now, at 58, lying in a hospital bed with no windows in the room and his lungs growing weaker by the day, it didn't feel like life was slipping away. It felt like it was being quietly erased. And even that didn't scare him anymore. Fear had turned to silence, and silence had become routine. But after reading Psalm 6 out loud, without even understanding why, Nick felt something different that night. It wasn't a miracle. There was no light on the wall, no angel at the door. It was a barely noticeable shift. His chest felt less tight, his head a little lighter, as if he'd opened a small window for something that had long tried to enter. And for the first time in weeks, he slept. A deep sleep, dreamless but peaceful. The next morning, everything looked the same. The artificial light still glowed under the door, reminding him the world outside kept moving. But inside, something had shifted. He reached again for the Bible, not to read, just to make sure it was still there. It was silent, open, steady, present, as if it was saying, "I haven't left." Nick took a slow breath. Then, he looked up at the ceiling. For the first time since arriving, he asked the nurse for something unexpected. "Could you bring me a sheet of paper?" The young nurse, surprised, didn't ask why. She just brought it along with a pen. Nick began copying the entire psalm, line by line. His handwriting was shaky, his hands weak, but his focus unshaken. When he finished, he folded the paper with care and placed it on the food tray. Later, when the nurse returned, he handed it to her. "There's a guy in the next room. I heard him coughing all night. Could you give this to him?" She paused, uncertain, but nodded. Nick didn't explain. He wasn't even sure it made sense. But deep inside, he felt the prayer couldn't just sit still. That the psalm wasn't just for him. And without realizing it, he'd started a chain. That afternoon, his monitor stayed steady, heartbeats even, oxygen flowing smoother than the past days. The doctors said little too early to call it progress. But Nick knew something was being restored inside him. Not his body. Not yet, but something deeper, something he couldn't name, but he could feel it, and that was enough. As night fell, Nick stared at the ceiling and thought of Sarah, his daughter, the one he hadn't seen in nearly 3 years, the one he'd fought with, disconnected from, sworn not to disturb again. Time had moved quickly, and the pain had settled in like an uninvited guest. He never knew how to ask for forgiveness, and he doubted she'd ever come back. But now, an old feeling, one he thought buried, was rising. What if she were here? Would he have the courage to read this psalm? With her, Nick closed his eyes, and for the first time, he spoke to God without reading anything. Just a whisper, from deep within, "I don't know if there's still time, but if she comes, give me the strength to say what I never could." Outside, city sounds rolled on. Ambulances, muffled voices, the distant buzz of a radio on another floor. But in that room, there was only a man who didn't know how to pray. Praying, a man who thought he couldn't feel anymore. Feeling, a man who claimed he had no faith. Speaking to God. And in that moment of stillness and blank paper, something invisible began to move. Because sometimes, the answer you're looking for begins when you decide to pass on what healed you. And Nick was about to discover he wasn't the only one hearing that prayer. The folded note arrived in the next room by late afternoon. The nurse, nearing the end of her shift, found Kevin sitting upright, staring blankly at the floor, arms crossed over his chest. He was 33, an IT technician, and had been in the ICU for 5 days, fighting a viral pneumonia that wouldn't break. His lungs were inflamed, his body feverish, and the doctors were beginning to discuss more aggressive treatment. But what hurt most, was the silence. Friends had stopped calling, his elderly parents couldn't visit, and the last message from his wife read, "If you won't fight, I can't fight for you." The nurse handed him the paper without saying, much, just a gesture. Kevin didn't react right away. He left the note on the small table beside the untouched cup of jello. That night, when the monitor beeped in a slow rhythm and nurse's footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway, he decided to open it. He read slowly, a handwritten copy of Psalm 6. The penmanship was uneven, almost childlike. At the bottom a line, scribbled in smaller letters, "I read this yesterday. I don't know what happened, but today I woke up different. Hope it helps you too." Kevin leaned back against the pillow, and without meaning to, tears slid down his face. He read it again, this time, whispering he was tired of promises and empty encouragements. But this felt like it came from someone who had actually been broken. The words entered like they belonged there. They were sad, but true. The next morning, Kevin's fever had gone down. It wasn't a miraculous recovery, not cinematic, but it was enough for him to breathe without pain, enough for his voice to return without burning. The doctor raised an eyebrow at the lab numbers, but said only, "Good sign, let's keep watching." That day, Kevin asked for paper. He copied the entire psalm again, just like he received it, but he added a line, "If you're reading this, someone before me was touched. I was. Maybe you will be too." He folded the paper and asked that it be sent to the pediatric wing. "A friend of mine has a son there. Maybe it'll help someone." The chain had started, and Nick had no idea. In the pediatric unit, the note made its way to the mother of Ellie, a girl undergoing leukemia treatment. As her daughter slept, the mother opened the envelope and began reading. Each word sounded like something she'd been wanting to say but didn't know how. She wept quietly, then picked up her phone and texted her brother, the one she hadn't spoken to in over a year. "I don't know how to start, but I need you to forgive me. Something touched me here today. I don't want to leave this hospital carrying what's been making me sick inside." Hours later, he replied, his voice cracked through the speakerphone. And two siblings, once separated by pride, were reunited by a psalm that didn't heal the body, but the heart. That afternoon, she printed 3 copies of the psalm and taped them to 2 doors nearby. The third she placed on the chapel's bulletin board. That same evening, the nurse who had delivered Nick's note to Kevin returned to room 213. "Feeling any better, Mr. Carter?" Nick nodded gently. "Did you give him the note?" "I did. He asked for paper today too. Seems like this is catching on." She smiled. Nick smiled back but said nothing. Inside, he knew something. The prayer was never just his. It never had been. Soon, little pages began showing up in hospital corridors, on food trays, on waiting room chairs, in the pockets of white coats. Most bore the same psalm, written in different handwriting, but with the same tone, the voice of someone who had suffered and chose not to keep it to themselves. This wasn't a miracle breaking through walls. It was a truth refusing to die. On one of those copies, left on the dusty lobby piano, someone scribbled, "I don't know who wrote this, but I know pain, and for that reason, I choose to believe with them." The chain was underway, invisible, quiet, but alive and powerful. Each piece of paper passed through unknown hands, touched hearts not expecting to be touched, and moved forward with the simplicity of miracles that don't need a stage. Back in room 213, Nick read updates on Sarah's phone. She had begun posting stories from people touched by the same psalm, comments, photos, audio messages. In each one, someone who had nearly given up, until that prayer arrived. "Dad, look at this," Sarah said, eyes bright. This woman found the note in the elevator. She was praying for her son in a coma. Yesterday, he moved his fingers for the first time. Nick's lips trembled into a smile. "I thought my life was over, but maybe it was just starting." In other people, she squeezed his hand. He passed it on. "And every person who does keeps your story going." That night, next to Nick's bed, the Bible stayed open. But now, something new, a handwritten list of names, dozens, people asking for prayer, patients, families, doctors, nurses. Sarah began writing them. Nick prayed for each one, name by name, because the chain had become something more. It wasn't about Nick anymore, or Sarah, or Walter. It was about what God does when someone, even at the end, decides to pass on what they received. But room 213 wouldn't be occupied for much longer, and the bed that had held so much pain was about to hold a new story, and with it, something left behind that would change one more life. The clock read for 42 p.m. when the door to room 213 creaked open. Nick was dozing, but his eyes opened at the sound of soft footsteps across the waxed floor. He assumed it was another nurse, maybe bringing his evening medication. But then he heard a voice he hadn't heard in over 1,000 days. Dad. Sarah stood in the doorway, hair tied in a rushed bun, backpack slung over her shoulder, eyes glistening like they'd waited years to cry. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just looked at each other, both trying to decide if this was really happening. Nick slowly adjusted his position in bed, afraid the slightest movement might shatter the moment. "You came," he whispered, voice weak but full. "I almost didn't," she admitted, her words raw with truth. "But last night, a friend sent me a photo of a note taped to a hospital door. Psalm 6, she said. It's been showing up all over the building. When I read it, I recognized your handwriting." Nick smiled as a single tear escaped before he could stop it. "It was, I copied it from a Bible that showed up here." Out of nowhere, Sarah stepped forward, pulled the chair close, and sat beside him. Between them, the silence had changed. No longer the silence of distance, but the kind that comes when presence finally replaces absence. She reached out and touched his hand, forgiving him without needing to say the words. "You know, there's still a lot that hurts, Dad. But when I read that psalm, it felt like you were asking for forgiveness." Nick squeezed her hand gently. His gaze was steady, even though his body was frail. "That's exactly what it was. And if you're willing, I want to pray with you. I don't really know how. But those words, they gave me something even the doctors couldn't. Peace." Sarah nodded. And there, father and daughter, hand in hand, eyes closed, read together. The same psalm Nick had whispered days before now, with voices of reconciliation, verse by verse, as if each line was rebuilding a piece of the bridge that had once collapsed between them. When they finished, Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder. They stayed like that for a while, listening to the beeping monitor, the gentle hum of machines, and the silence that, this time, felt like healing. Later, while Nick rested, Sarah picked up the Bible on the nightstand. She flipped through its well-kept pages, pausing when she reached Psalm 6. At the bottom of the page, in tiny handwriting not belonging to her father, was a simple message. "If these words touch someone, keep passing them on." She pulled out her phone, took a photo of the page, and posted it with a short caption. "My dad is in the hospital. We hadn't spoken in years. Today, we prayed together, and it all started with this psalm that appeared in his room. I don't know who left this Bible, but I know it arrived at the perfect time. Keep passing it on." Within minutes, comments started to pour in. People sharing their stories, asking for prayers, saying they too knew someone who needed hope. Meanwhile, on a different floor, a new patient arrived at the hospital. Among the items by his bedside was a folded piece of paper with the same psalm, copied by Kevin, sent by Nick, shared by Sarah, and now ready to be born again. Because when a prayer moves across generations, it never really ends. It echoes. Back in room 213, Nick still didn't know. But his story wouldn't be remembered for illness. It would be remembered for the prayer he never knew he had in him, for the daughter he thought he'd never see again, and for the words he chose to pass along, even when he didn't fully understand them. What Sarah didn't yet know was that the Bible in her hands had a story of its own, a much older one, and that she, too, was part of its passing. The next morning, Megan, the nurse, who had been with Nick since his first day, walked into room 213 carrying his breakfast. She saw Sarah sitting in the chair by the bed, gently flipping through the Bible as her father slept. The two of them had spent the night there, father and daughter, side by side, as if time had decided to return what it once stole. "That Bible's been important, hasn't it?" Megan asked softly, careful not to wake him. Sarah nodded, her fingers resting on the pages. "Do you know who brought it in?" Megan hesitated. "That's the strange part. I asked everyone on the night shift. No one remembers bringing it, not even the chaplain interns. I've looked into it." Sarah frowned and turned to the page where Psalm 6 was marked. Her eyes landed again on the handwritten note at the bottom. "Keep passing it on." During the shift change, Megan brought the Bible to Harold, the hospital chaplain, a man with a gentle voice, a quiet presence, and a habit of carrying prayer cards in one pocket and tissues in the other. When he saw the Bible, he paused longer than usual. "This Bible, I think I've seen it before." He took a moment to remember the name, Walter, a patient in his 80s who had passed away 3 months earlier. Widowed, No children, always with a soft smile, quiet but consistent. Every time someone entered his room, he'd ask if he could pray for them. No one ever said no. Walter was known for carrying his Bible everywhere, but when he passed, his belongings were collected, except for one. The Bible had vanished. We looked for days, Harold said, but it wasn't in his room, not in the chapel. We assumed someone took it, but now, here it is, and opened to this psalm. He ran his fingers over the cover like he was touching a memory. Walter read Psalm 6 every night, said it was the only one that gave his soul rest. Sarah listened quietly. What she felt wasn't coincidence, it was testimony, a sacred kind, of inheritance, not of blood, but of belief. A faith passed through pages and hands and voices, from a man who had already gone, to another who thought he was too late. Back in room 213, Nick awoke to faint voices in the hallway. Megan returned and shared what she'd learned. When Nick heard the name Walter, he went quiet. He didn't know him, never saw his face, but he felt a certainty rise in him that someone, somewhere, had interceded before he even prayed. "So you think the Bible was his?" Nick asked. "I'm almost sure," Megan replied. "And now it's here, open to this psalm. Like it knew where to go." Nick stared at the ceiling. A slow breath escaped his lungs. Maybe faith doesn't die. Maybe it just changes beds. The words lingered in the air. Megan repeated them in her mind. Later that day, Harold wrote the sentence on a framed board in the chapel's entrance. Sometimes, faith doesn't die, it just changes beds. Visitors began noticing it, reading it, taking pictures. Some wept without knowing why. Others just reached out to touch the glass like it held something sacred. That afternoon, Sarah printed several copies of Psalm 6 and gently slipped them into neighboring rooms. Quietly, intentionally, she folded each one with care and wrote at the bottom, "Pray for someone, and if you can, keep passing it on." That was when the Bible, once silent, began to breathe again. It was no longer just Walter's, no longer just Nick's or Sarah's. It had become a thread, connecting souls who thought they were forgotten. It had become a map for those who believed they had lost all direction. And in a hospital where so many came to fight for their lives, few realized that faith was doing rounds to Dot later that evening. Harold returned to the chapel and found a woman kneeling by the front row. She was holding one of Sarah's copies, reading it aloud through tears. He sat quietly nearby, listening. When she finished, she turned to him and said, "This found me right when I needed it." Harold smiled. It seems to have good timing by then. The Psalm 6 papers had begun to travel on their own. Nurses passed them between shifts. Families tucked them into flower bouquets. Doctors slipped them into discharge folders. No one told them to. They just did. The Bible had become more than a book. It was now a messenger, a vessel, a witness. One patient, recently discharged, left behind a note in his room. "To whoever finds this next, read it like it was written for you, because maybe it was." And all of it began with a man who thought his time had run out. A man who barely knew how to pray. A man who dared to believe that even a single psalm, whispered in the dark, could echo in someone else's dawn. But what no one yet realized was that this chain was still in motion, and the next link was already forming just a hallway away. In the waiting area of the south wing, Amanda sat against the wall, waiting for her son's discharge papers after his heart surgery. It was her 5th day in the hospital. Worn down, emotionally drained, she stared into space until a folded piece of paper on the bulletin board caught her eye. Taped just below a notice about routine labs, someone had pinned a typed copy of Psalm 6, with a handwritten note beneath. "If you're tired, read this out loud." That's what I did. She read it right there, standing up, holding her breath between verses. Midway through, tears blurred the words. She felt each sentence reaching into the exact places where her anxiety lived. When she finished, she pulled out her phone and texted her sister, the one she hadn't spoken to in over a year. "I don't know where to begin, but I need your forgiveness. Something touched me today. I don't want to leave this hospital carrying what's been eating me from the inside." A few hours later, her sister replied. They talked on the phone through sniffles and silence, and two sisters, separated by pride, were reconnected by a psalm that hadn't healed the body, but had begun to heal the heart. In the staff break room, Julia, a nurse known for her fast pace and no-nonsense attitude, found a copy of the same psalm among scattered charts. She was about to toss it in the trash, but paused when she read the note. Walter prayed this every night. Now it's my turn. She didn't know who Walter was, but the sentence stuck with her like a whisper. During her shift break, she read the psalm alone in the locker room. Afterward, she called her father, recently diagnosed with Alzheimer's. "Dad, do you remember Psalm 6? There was a pause. "I do, sort of. Lord, heal me. My bones are in agony." "Your mother read that to me in the hospital. Remember?" She didn't remember, but he did, and something in her cracked wide open, and that was exactly what needed to break for love to pour in again. On another floor, Ethan lay in room 219 after a severe anxiety attack. A therapist had slipped a white envelope into his hands. Inside, a printed copy of Psalm 6. He resisted. He wasn't religious. But later that evening, he heard someone down the hall reading aloud the same verses, and curiosity overcame his reluctance. He opened it. By the time he reached the final line, he described a kind of silence inside that he hadn't known in years. Ethan also asked for paper, also copied the psalm, also wrote something at the bottom. "I didn't think I'd last another week, but now, I'm writing to whoever might feel the same." His note ended up in the ER. That's where Isabel read it, just before receiving news that she'd be staying in the hospital for another 2 weeks. She wrote a message on a post-it and left it at the front desk. "God spoke to me in the hallway, and today, his name was Psalm 6. The chain had no name, no organization, no hashtag. It was unseen, unplanned, quiet, but it was alive and powerful. Each piece of paper passed through hands that never knew each other, hearts that had given up expecting anything and carried with it the kind of comfort that doesn't need explanation." Back in room 213, Nick was reading updates on Sarah's phone. She had begun to share the stories sent by people touched by the same psalm, comments, voice notes, photos, in each one. A soul that had almost given up, until this prayer reached them. "Dad, look at this," Sarah said, her voice breaking. This woman found the note in the elevator. She was praying for her son in a coma. Yesterday, he moved his fingers for the first time. Nick's lips curled into a trembling smile. "I thought my life was over, but maybe it was just beginning. In someone else." Sarah squeezed his hand. "You passed it on, and every person who keeps passing it keeps your story alive." That night, beside Nick's bed, the Bible remained open, but now, something new rested beside it. A handwritten list of names, dozens, people who had asked for prayer, patients, visitors, nurses, doctors. Sarah wrote each name. Nick prayed over them, one by one, because the chain had grown beyond what anyone could trace. It wasn't about Nick anymore, or Sarah, or Walter. It was about what God does when someone, even someone at the edge of everything, dares to share what gave them peace. But room 213 wouldn't remain occupied for much longer, and the bed that had held so much pain was about to cradle a new beginning, and with it, something that would stay behind, waiting for the next name, the next hand, the next heart. Room 213 was quiet. Not the usual hospital silence filled with beeping monitors and soft footfalls. This was a deeper, quiet, full, final, sacred. Nick had passed in the early morning hours, peacefully, in his sleep. No struggle, no sound, just a long, slow exhale. Sarah was there, holding his hand when he let go. There were no final words, just a gentle squeeze, as if to say, "I did what I came to do." Later that morning, the bed was made up for the next patient. Fresh sheets, clean floor, but one thing was left untouched. On the nightstand, the Bible remained, still open to Psalm 6. Next to it, a brown envelope with a short message handwritten on the front. "For whoever comes after me." Inside was a letter, in Nick's handwriting. The words were slightly shaky, but clear. "If you're reading this, that means there's still time." That's what I learned. I didn't know how to pray. I wasn't even sure if God still listened, but I said one prayer, just one, and it found me before I left. If it's found you too, then you're already healing. Don't keep this to yourself, pass it on, because sometimes the answer we're searching for is written on a forgotten page left on a nightstand. With love, Nick. The note was never removed. The hospital staff decided to leave it, part of the room now, a piece of its story. The next patient, a man named Benjamin recovering from a heart attack, found the envelope his first night after surgery. He read it in silence. Tears filled his eyes. He picked up the Bible and held it close to his chest. Then he asked for paper. Later that day, Benjamin wrote his own note. His words were different, but the message the same. He left Nick's letter untouched, sacred. The responsibility had been handed to him now. And just like those before him, he accepted it. Downstairs in the chapel, Sarah left a printed copy of Psalm 6 on the altar table. She had it laminated, trimmed with care. At the top, in bold black letters, she had written, "The prayer that moved from bed to bed, and still moves today." In the chapel entrance, Chaplain Harold added one final frame to the wall of sacred phrases. It held Nick's own words. "Sometimes, faith doesn't die, it just changes beds." The chain that had begun with one whispered prayer, one man reaching for a book he hadn't touched in years, was now part of the hospital's rhythm, an unspoken liturgy of hope, passed along in folded paper and quiet voices. And more than that, it had become a legacy, whispered not only between patient and God, but from one heart to another. A woman named Lydia later found a copy of Psalm 6 on the elevator floor. She was leaving after visiting her husband in the ICU. She picked it up, read it in the car, and cried until her hands stopped shaking. Then she wrote in the comments of a video, "I don't know who Nick is, but I know what his words did for me. Thank you, please. Keep passing this on. If you've come this far, it's because this story spoke to something inside you that doctors can't diagnose. Maybe you know someone in a hospital. Maybe you're waiting for answers. Maybe it's your soul that's tired, even if your body's fine. So today, I invite you to be part of this chain. Write the name of someone who needs healing in the comments. Whether they're sick in body or in spirit, write it as an act of faith. Because God hears the things we can't always say out loud. And if this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope. Not just to comfort them, but to remind them that answers can still arrive, even in silence, even in the waiting. And if you haven't yet subscribed to this channel, do it now, because stories like Nick's are still happening, and every one of them carries this promise that no one is truly alone, not even in the last room at the end of the hall.